fade in through the haze of Texas heat. The sun hammers down on endless coils of barbed wire stretching across flat earth. Dust devils spiral between guard towers. Through rusted gates they march, German soldiers gaunt and sunburned, their uniforms faded to ghosts of what they once were. An American guard steps forward, in his hands a metal tray, bacon, scrambled eggs, a bottle of Coca-Cola beading with condensation. They expected punishment. Instead, they were served breakfast. For men who had fought under the banner of the Reich captivity in America was supposed to be a reckoning. Humiliation, perhaps. Suffering, certainly. But what they found was something far stranger. Decency. Clean beds, medical care, food, better than they'd seen in years. And as one prisoner would later say, "It was in America that I first tasted freedom." This is the story of why the enemy found comfort in the hands of the nation they had fought to destroy. The metallic clang of gates echoes into silence. Archival music swells softly beneath the weight of what comes next. By 1943, the tides of war had turned. North Africa was lost to the Allies. Italy burned under invasion. German troops surrendered not in dozens, but in tens of thousands. The Wehrmacht, once seemingly invincible, now bled men faster than Berlin could count. But victory created its own problem. What do you do with a flood of prisoners when the continent itself has become a battlefield? Europe could no longer hold them. Britain was overwhelmed, its cities still smouldering from the Blitz, its resources stretched to breaking. So America, thousands of miles from the front, untouched by bombers vast and capable, became their keeper. From 1942 to 1945, more than 425,000 German prisoners of war were shipped across the Atlantic and dispersed into over 700 camps across the United States. From the plains of Nebraska to the cotton fields of Alabama, from the forests of Wisconsin to the scrubland of Texas, their presence surprised everyone. Farmers who had never seen a foreign soldier suddenly found the enemy harvesting their wheat. Small-town civilians watched through chain-link fences as young Germans repaired roads, sang songs behind wire, and worked the land their sons had left behind to fight. Yet these men soldiers of Hitler's Wehrmacht soon realized something deeply, almost absurdly ironic. Their captivity was more humane than the lives many free Americans endured back home. So the question emerges, quiet but urgent. How did the United States, in the midst of total war, end up treating enemy soldiers with dignity? And why did so many Germans describe their imprisonment not as punishment but as peace? The answer lies not in policy alone, but in something harder to quantify. Something about the American experiment itself, its contradictions, its ideals, and the strange moral clarity it found even in the fog of global conflict. Trains rattle across heartland tracks, barracks rise in orderly rows. American families stop their trucks to stare as columns of prisoners march past. And somewhere in that collision of world's history takes an unexpected turn. Tunisia, 1943. The desert stretches in every direction, colorless and merciless. The battlefield is a graveyard of burnt-out tanks and abandoned artillery. The sky vibrates with the drone of P-38, lightnings circling overhead like vultures. German soldiers emerge from their positions, hands raised, rifles dropped into the sand. The Afrika Korps Rommel's pride has been broken. Over 250,000 Axis troops lay down their arms. Among them, more than 150,000 Germans. They brace for what comes next. Many expect vengeance. They've heard the Allied propaganda, seen the leaflets dropped from bombers, calling them monsters to be exterminated. They've been told that surrender means death, that the Americans show no mercy, that capture is the end. Instead, an American officer approaches. His uniform is dusty but crisp. He looks at them not with hatred, but with something closer to exhaustion. "You're our guests now," he says simply. They're given cigarettes, canteens of water, rations, real food, not the watery gruel they'd survived on for months. Some men weep. Others sit in stunned silence, unable to process the kindness. For soldiers hardened by desert warfare and brutalized by Nazi discipline, it feels like a trick, a prelude to something worse. But nothing worse comes. They're herded into makeshift camps, photographed, registered. Medics tend to their wounds without prejudice. No beatings, no executions. Just procedure calm and bureaucratic. As they board, Liberty ships bound for the unknown, rumors spread like wildfire through the ranks. Some whisper they're being sent to Siberia to freeze in Soviet labor camps. Others believe they'll be shipped to tropical jungles to die of disease. A few think they're being taken to secret facilities for experimentation. Then the truth filters down from the officers their destination is America. To most, it sounds like fantasy. America, the land they've been taught to despise, the symbol of decadence and weakness. The nation their Führer promised would collapse under its own corruption is now their prison. The Atlantic crossing takes weeks. Below decks packed into converted cargo holds the prisoners' weight. But even here the treatment continues to defy expectation. They're fed regularly. Medical officers conduct checkups. They're even allowed to write censored letters, home brief messages that might reach wives and mothers in a Germany they no longer recognize. Compared to the chaos of North Africa, to the constant shelling and the fear and the hunger, this feels almost civilized, almost peaceful. The ocean rolls beneath them, endless and dark. Some men play cards. Others stare at the ceiling and wonder what home looks like now, whether their families still live, whether Germany itself still stands. A young Obergefreiter named Hans Müller writes in his diary, the pencil stub moving carefully across rationed paper. The guards were young Americans. They joked with us, shared their cigarettes. We were shocked they didn't hate us. The shock doesn't fade, it deepens. When the ships finally dock, New York, Norfolk, Charleston, the prisoners are brought on deck to disembark. The first glimpse of America hits them like a physical force. Skyscrapers pierce the morning fog. Cranes swing cargo through the air with mechanical precision. Everything is clean, ordered, untouched by war. For men who left behind a continent in ruins, it's almost incomprehensible. They're loaded onto trains, heading inland, away from the coast, deep into the American heartland. Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Wisconsin. The trains rattle through towns that look like postcards through farmland so vast it seems to have no end. The prisoners press their faces to the windows and try to reconcile what they see with what they've been taught. It doesn't reconcile. The train whistle cuts through the prairie silence. The rhythm of the tracks becomes a kind of heartbeat, steady and relentless, carrying them deeper into a country that shouldn't exist. Not like this, not so untouched, not so impossibly whole. When the camp gates first open, the prisoners steel themselves. This is where the mask drops. This is where the real punishment begins. But the commandant who greets them quotes the Geneva Convention, article by article, right by right. He speaks in measured tones, almost bored, as if this is simply procedure. Each man is registered, photographed, fingerprinted, assigned a bunk number, given a medical examination. There are showers, real showers, with hot water and soap, medical stations staffed by actual doctors, libraries with books in German, recreation yards with space to walk. One prisoner will later write, "We could not believe it. We thought it was propaganda, a staged show before the real treatment began, until we tasted the food. The meals follow American military standards. Breakfast eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. Lunch stew with vegetables, bread, fruit. Dinner meat, potatoes, gravy. Portions that would have fed 2 men back in the Afrika Korps. For soldiers who survived on watery soup and stale bread in Tunisia, who watched comrades die of dysentery and malnutrition, it's a revelation that borders on the surreal. They eat slowly, at first suspicious, waiting for the catch. But there is no catch. The camp kitchens hum with activity. American cooks serve German prisoners with the same indifference they'd show anyone else. No poison, no spoiled food. Just standard military fare prepared according to regulation. At night, lying in bunks that don't collapse under roofs that don't leak, the prisoners listen to sounds they haven't heard in years. Crickets, wind through grass. And from the guard barracks, American radio broadcasts, Bing Crosby crooning about white Christmases, Glenn Miller's orchestra swinging through In the Mood. Songs of a nation untouched by bombing raids. Music that doesn't know what rubble sounds like. It's a world away from Hamburg's firestorms, from Berlin's shattered streets, from the howl of air raid sirens that has become the soundtrack of German life. Some men lie awake, unable to sleep, not from fear, but from its absence. The silence is too loud, the safety too strange. Others sleep deeply for the first time since the war began, their bodies finally believing what their minds cannot, that tonight no bombs will fall, no artillery will scream overhead, no officers will drag them from sleep for another forced march. The barracks are simple but solid. Wooden frames, proper mattresses, blankets that smell clean. Through the windows they can see the Texas sky, vast and star-filled, unpolluted by smoke or searchlights. A few prisoners gather near the fence, speaking in low voices. They share cigarettes, American cigarettes distributed freely, and try to make sense of their situation. Maybe they're fattening us up before the real work begins, one suggests. Maybe they need us healthy for labor camps, another offers. But a third, older, more thoughtful, says nothing. He simply smokes and stares at the horizon where the land meets sky in a line so clean it looks drawn by God. He's thinking about home, about the Germany he left where food was scarce and hope was scarcer, where every man suspected his neighbor, where children were taught to report their parents, where speaking freely could mean death. Here, behind barbed wire in captivity, he feels something he hasn't felt in years. He feels safe. The irony isn't lost on him. But irony doesn't make it less true. As the lights go out across the camp, darkness settles soft and complete. No flares, no fires. Just the cricket song and the wind and 400 men discovering that imprisonment can sometimes feel like liberation. Days turn to weeks, weeks become months. And slowly, impossibly, the camps transform into something no one expected. Small, functioning societies with their own rhythms, their own culture, their own strange sense of normalcy. They build theaters from scrap lumber and salvaged materials, stages lit by improvised footlights, curtains sewn from surplus canvas. On Saturday nights, prisoners perform plays, some classical, some satirical, some daringly subversive. In one camp, they stage a comedy, mocking Nazi officers. The caricatures are broad and unmistakable. The pompous commandant, the brutal sergeant, the fanatical party member. The audience roars with laughter. Acts that would have meant execution back home. Orchestras form. Men who were musicians before the war, or who learned instruments in Hitler Youth, gather to play. Violins, accordions, makeshift drums. They perform Beethoven and Brahms, but also American jazz, which they'd been taught was degenerate music. The guards stand outside the barracks listening, tapping their feet. Football teams organize. Germans versus Germans, but sometimes guards join in, and the games become raucous, competitive, surprisingly friendly. They argue over fouls in broken English and fractured German, and afterwards share cigarettes and stories. Schools emerge. Officers who were teachers, professors, engineers before the war begin holding classes. Mathematics, history, philosophy, languages. Young soldiers who left school at 16 to join the Wehrmacht sit in makeshift classrooms hungry for knowledge they'd been denied. The US military permits newspapers in German run by POW editors. They're monitored, censored for security, but otherwise allowed to operate freely. Prisoners write articles, essays, even poetry. They debate politics carefully, tentatively testing the boundaries of what can be said, and they discover those boundaries are wider than anything they'd known. Here we could finally say what we thought one former prisoner will recall, without fear, without looking over our shoulders. It was the strangest thing behind barbed wire we found freedom of speech. The irony cuts deep. In Nazi Germany, every word was suspect, every conversation potentially fatal. Here, as prisoners of war, they could question, debate, even criticize. They were still captives. The wire was real. The guards armed the boundaries clear. But within those boundaries they were treated as human beings, not as numbers, not as ideological instruments, but as men with minds and voices and worth. American guards grew fond of them. Not all, but many. They exchanged songs through the fence, taught each other slang. At Christmas, some guards brought gifts, chocolate bars, magazines, hand-carved trinkets. Prisoners responded with handmade crafts, drawings, small tokens of gratitude. For a brief moment, amid a war that had consumed the world, humanity breached its own walls. There were tensions, of course. Some prisoners remained ardent. Nazis tried to enforce party discipline within the camps, threatened those who embraced American values. Camp officials had to separate the diehards from the rest, creating special compounds for the unrepentant. But for most, the experience was transformative in ways both subtle and profound. They watched American soldiers treat them with casual respect, watched medics care for German wounded with the same attention given to American casualties, watched officers enforce rules fairly without cruelty or caprice. They saw a system that, while imperfect, operated on principles rather than power. law rather than force, process rather than whim. And slowly, quietly, their understanding of the world began to shift. The barbed wire remained, the guard towers still watched, but inside the fence, something unexpected was growing. Not rebellion or resentment, but a kind of reluctant admiration. A dawning awareness that perhaps everything they'd been taught about America, about democracy, about freedom, had been a lie. At night, after the lights went out, they whispered to each other in the darkness. Some spoke of home with longing, others with dread. And a few, just a few at first, then more, began to wonder if going back was really what they wanted at all. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could work, but not for war production. Not in factories making bullets or bombs, not in shipyards building destroyers. The line was clear, the rules specific, so they worked the land instead. They harvested crops under the vast American sky, corn in Iowa, wheat in Kansas, cotton in Alabama. They cut timber in Wisconsin forests, the axes ringing out in rhythm. They repaired roads in Oklahoma, laid irrigation pipes in Arizona, picked fruit in California orchards. In return, they earned wages. Not much, 80 cents a day in camp credits, but enough to buy small luxuries at the camp canteens. Chocolate bars, tobacco, soap, writing paper, art supplies. For men who owned nothing, it felt like wealth. Rural America, bleeding young men to the war, suffering labor shortages that threatened entire harvests, welcomed them cautiously at first, then with growing appreciation. Farmers who had lost sons to the Pacific or Europe found themselves working alongside the enemy, and discovered they weren't quite enemies after all. A Nebraska farmer will remember it this way. They worked hard, didn't complain, did what you asked and did it right. After a while, I forgot they were Germans. They were just boys trying to get home. The prisoners arrive at farms in trucks guarded but not shackled. They spread out across the fields in work details, their movements efficient and practiced. German discipline applied to American agriculture. Some farmers bring them lemonade during breaks. Others share lunch sandwiches, apples, cold milk from the dairy. Small gestures that mean more than the farmers realize. The prisoners respond with respect. They work carefully, waste nothing, take pride in tasks completed well. It's partly discipline, partly gratitude, partly something else, a desire to prove they're not the monsters the propaganda painted them as. Conversations develop. Broken English meets broken German. Hand gestures fill the gaps. A farmer points to a fence that needs mending. A prisoner nods, assesses the damage, begins repairs without being told how. Trust builds slowly, like crops growing invisible at first, then undeniable. By harvest time, some farmers request the same work details again. They know these men now, know who's reliable, who's skilled with machinery, who has a gift for coaxing life from difficult soil. The moral lines that seemed so clear from a distance blur up close. American propaganda had depicted Germans as inhuman, as fanatics devoted to evil. But here, working side by side under the sun, what the farmers see are young men, tired, homesick, ordinary. Not so different from their own sons fighting overseas. The prisoners spend their camp credits carefully. At the canteen, they browse shelves stocked with American goods brands they'd only heard of in propaganda films that mocked American consumerism. Hershey's chocolate, Lucky Strike, cigarettes, Coca-Cola. They buy sketch pads and pencils, and in the evenings they draw. Portraits of each other, landscapes of the camps, memories of home rendered in careful graphite lines. Some send money converted and censored back to families in Germany, though many doubt it will arrive. Others save planning for a future they can barely imagine. The work itself becomes a kind of therapy. Physical labor under open sky, far from the trenches and the bombing and the death. The simple satisfaction of planting seeds, watching them grow, harvesting what you've tended. It's honest work, clean work, work that builds rather than destroys. For men who spent years as instruments of war, it's a return to something fundamental, something human. At day's end, riding back to camp in the trucks, they're exhausted but not broken, dirty but not degraded. They watch the sun set over American farmland and feel something they haven't felt since before the war. Usefulness without violence, purpose without destruction. The barbed wire comes into view, the guard towers, the reminder of what they are. But even that reminder has lost its sting, because they've seen the other side now, seen how the enemy lives, how they think, what they value, and it's changed everything. Years of indoctrination don't vanish overnight. The propaganda runs deep, woven into thoughts and reflexes, into the very language they use to understand the world. America, they'd been taught, was a nation of weaklings and mongrels, a country without culture, without discipline, without soul. A place where individualism bred chaos, where democracy meant disorder, where Jewish influence corrupted everything. But the camps revealed a contradiction impossible to ignore. American officers enforced fairness even toward their captives. Discipline was firm, but never sadistic. Rules applied equally. When a guard overstepped, he faced consequences. When a prisoner had a legitimate grievance, it was heard. This consistency, this predictability was new. Under Nazi rule, justice was arbitrary. Favor depended on party loyalty, on racial purity, on the whims of those in power. Here, it depended on conduct and regulation. Inside camp libraries, German soldiers discovered books they'd never been allowed to read. Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, American authors like Steinbeck and Hemingway. Political philosophy, democratic theory, ideas that had been banned, burned, erased from German intellectual life. They read carefully at first, expecting propaganda. But what they found was something more dangerous than propaganda. Coherent arguments, compelling visions, worlds of thought that challenged everything they'd accepted. Late at night, in barracks lit by dim bulbs, they debated. Quietly, because some prisoners still clung to Nazi orthodoxy and would report dissent if they heard it. But the conversations happened. What if democracy wasn't weak? What if individual rights weren't chaos? What if the Führer had been wrong? Dangerous questions, unthinkable questions, but impossible to stop thinking. One former prisoner will write, "The American idea that a man is worth something simply because he's a man was new to us. We'd been taught worth came from the collective, from service to the Volk, from racial superiority. But here, they treated us as individuals, as human beings with inherent dignity. For many, it sparked an identity crisis. Who were they, if not soldiers of the Reich? What had they been fighting for if the enemy turned out to be more humane than their own leaders? Some prisoners requested permission to stay in America after the war. They wrote letters to camp commanders, to immigration officials, pleading their case. They had nothing to return to homes, destroyed families, missing a country in ruins. Here they'd found something worth keeping. Others wrote to families back in Germany, letters carefully worded, to pass censorship but urgent in their message: abandon the party, renounce the ideology. The war is lost, but more than that, the cause was never just. These weren't conversions achieved through lectures or propaganda films. The US military tried those too, showing documentaries about American democracy, screening footage of Nazi atrocities. Some prisoners dismissed it as lies. Others watched in silence, struggling to reconcile what they saw with what they'd believed. But the real transformation came through experience, through being treated fairly day after day, week after week, through watching American soldiers live their values rather than merely proclaim them. It was an education in democracy delivered not through ideology, but through example. A young soldier who'd joined the Wehrmacht at 17, who'd never known anything but Hitler's Germany, sits in the camp library reading the American Constitution. He doesn't understand all of it. The English is difficult, the concepts foreign, but something in it resonates. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He thinks about the camps he'd heard rumors of back home. The whispers about what happened to Jews, to Slavs, to anyone deemed unworthy. He'd dismissed them as enemy propaganda. Now he wonders. Outside, the Texas wind rattles the barracks. Guard towers stand silhouetted against the stars. The wire gleams in moonlight. He's still a prisoner, but his mind, maybe for the first time in his life, is free. And that freedom terrifies him almost as much as it exhilarates him. Because once you see clearly, you can't unsee. Once you know better, you can't unknow. The transformation is internal, invisible, but total. But not everyone approved. As the war raged on across two oceans, as American boys died in European hedgerows and Pacific jungles, word spread through hometown newspapers and dinner table conversations. German prisoners of war were eating steak while civilians endured. Rationing. The headlines wrote themselves. Enemy soldiers fed, while our boys starve. POWs get better treatment than our own troops. Letters to editors poured in sharp with grief and anger. Families who had lost sons demanded answers. Why feed the enemy when our boys go hungry? Why house them in comfort when Americans sleep in foxholes? Why treat them like guests when they killed our children? The protests were loudest near military bases, in towns that had sent whole graduating classes to war and received too many telegrams beginning. We regret to inform you, some communities organized demonstrations. Women held signs outside camp fences. Veterans groups wrote to Congress. The moral calculus seemed simple. These men wore the uniform of evil they served. Hitler, they deserved nothing. Yet the government insisted. Secretary of War Henry Stimson defended the policy in measured, careful language. Moral strength was America's weapon. Adherence to international law was what separated civilization from barbarism. The Geneva Convention wasn't a suggestion, it was a commitment. To violate it would be to become what we fought against. The argument didn't satisfy everyone. Grief doesn't yield to logic. Anger doesn't bow to principle. But slowly, grudgingly, something shifted. In small towns across America, children discovered the prisoners weren't monsters. They waved through fences. The prisoners waved back. Some guards allowed brief conversations, supervised, limited, but human. Women who had lost husbands, who had every reason for hatred, sometimes baked bread for the work details. Not because they forgave, but because cruelty felt beneath them, because meanness didn't honor the dead. Local churches debated the morality. Ministers preached about loving your enemy, about turning the other cheek, about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Some congregations embraced it, others walked out in protest. Christmas 1944 brought something unexpected. In a camp in Texas, a local choir requested permission to sing carols near the fence. The camp commander approved, uncertain what would happen. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell light and rare across the prairie, American voices rose in song. Silent night, O come all ye faithful. Hark, the herald angels sing. From inside the camp, German voices joined them. The same carols, the same melodies, different words. Stille Nacht, Hörbe o Icha, good Lucke biegen. Hört der Engel helle Lieder. Guards and prisoners and townspeople singing together through barbed wire. Enemy and enemy united by something older than nations, deeper than war. Some people wept. Others stood silent, unable to process the contradiction. It was a small miracle compassion surviving amid total war. By 1945, as the war in Europe ground toward its bitter conclusion, most camps had settled into an almost domestic rhythm. Tensions remained, suspicions lingered, but the sharp edges had dulled. A former prisoner from Camp Hearn, Texas, will write decades later, "They treated us as men, not monsters. Even when they had reason to hate us, they chose dignity over revenge. We will never forget that." The camps became laboratories of a sort, testing whether humanity could persist in inhuman times, whether principles meant anything when tested by pain and loss. The answer wasn't perfect. Some guards were cruel. Some camps had problems. Violence occasionally flared. The system had flaws. But overall, the treatment of German POWs stood as testament civilization could exist even in war. Law could hold even under pressure. Decency wasn't weakness, it was strength of a different kind. For many prisoners, the hardest part wasn't captivity. It was knowing that eventually they'd have to leave, that the war would end and they'd be shipped back to whatever remained of home. That this strange, unexpected sanctuary behind American barbed wire was only temporary. And that returning to Germany meant facing the ruins of everything they'd once believed. May 1945. The war in Europe ends not with glory but with exhaustion. Berlin falls. Hitler dies in his bunker. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years collapses after 12. In camps across America, prisoners gather around radios, listening to the news in stunned silence. Some feel relief, others emptiness. A few still cling to disbelief, certain it's Allied propaganda, certain the Führer will rise again. But most simply feel the weight of what comes next. The long journey home begins. One by one, camps empty. Prisoners board trains back to the coasts, then ships back across the Atlantic. The same route in reverse, but nothing else is the same. They carry small possessions, now English dictionaries, sketches, photographs taken with guards who became friends, souvenirs of captivity that somehow feel like treasures. The ocean crossing is quieter this time. No rumors, no fear of the unknown, just the certain knowledge of what awaits a Europe in ruins. When they disembark in French or British ports, the contrast hits immediately. The continent they left already damaged has been obliterated, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed. millions dead or displaced. Germany itself is barely recognizable. They travel through landscapes of ash and broken stone. Towns they knew as children, simply gone. The trains move slowly, stopping frequently because the tracks are damaged, because bridges no longer exist, because everything is broken. Some find letters waiting at Red Cross stations. Others find nothing at all. Messages from wives who became widows, children who don't remember their fathers, families scattered or erased entirely. A few discover that home still stands, damaged but standing. They walk through doors they thought they'd never see again, embrace relatives who aged a decade in 5 years. Others find only absence, empty lots where houses were, silence where neighborhoods thrived. They'd lived better as captives than as citizens of their fallen Reich. The irony is crushing. In Texas, they ate regularly. In Oklahoma, they slept without fear. In America, enemy territory, they found safety. Here, in the fatherland they fought for, they find only devastation. Some carry strange wisdom now hard-won and transformative. A former prisoner stands in the ruins of his hometown, holding an English dictionary and a sketch of the Texas camp where he spent 3 years. America showed me the difference between power and dignity, he'll write. For many, that realization will shape what comes next. The rebuilding, the reckoning, West Germany's unlikely transformation from fascist state to democratic ally. The lessons learned behind barbed wire will echo through generations. The German POW camps in America became an unlikely chapter of moral clarity amid chaos. A footnote in the vast narrative of World War II, yet one that reveals something essential about the nature of civilization itself. At a time when hatred seemed universal, when entire peoples were being systematically exterminated, when the world had descended into industrial-scale brutality, the United States upheld a principle that even an enemy deserved: humanity. This policy wasn't born of mercy alone. It was calculated, deliberate, rooted in belief that adherence to law, to order, to moral high ground was what separated democracy from tyranny. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in war is. Some camps faced discipline issues. A few guards were cruel, letting personal hatred override regulation. Tensions sometimes flared into violence. The system had cracks, but overall, the treatment of prisoners stood as quiet testament. Civilization could exist even in war. Standards could hold even under pressure. The Geneva Convention wasn't merely paper, it was practice. Years later, many former prisoners returned to America, not as enemies, but as tourists, as immigrants, as students and businessmen. Some sought out the guards who once watched them, finding friendship where enmity had been. They brought their children to see the camp's most now empty fields or repurposed buildings, and told stories their kids could barely believe. Stories of kindness in captivity, of dignity in defeat, of discovering democracy not through propaganda, but through lived experience. For them, the war had ended not in defeat alone, but in discovery. They'd left Germany as soldiers of the Reich, believers in its cause, or at least complicit in its machinery. They returned as something else, men who had seen an alternative, who carried within them seeds of a different worldview. Many became advocates for democracy in post-war Germany. Teachers, politicians, journalists who remembered what fairness looked like, who had lived under both systems and could testify to the difference. Perhaps that was America's greatest victory, not just military, but moral. Not conquest of territory, but transformation of minds. The camps are mostly gone now, the barracks demolished, the wire removed. The land returned to farmland or developed into suburbs. But what happened there remains preserved in letters and memoirs, and in the memories of men who found humanity in the most unlikely place. In the end, the German prisoners of war who found comfort in captivity discovered something beyond freedom. They found humanity itself, raw, imperfect, but real. Behind barbed wire, they saw fairness. In defeat, they found respect. And in a nation that had every reason to hate them, every justification for cruelty, they learned the meaning of dignity. As one former prisoner wrote decades later, his hand still steady despite age, "The Americans conquered us not with weapons, but with decency." War changes men. It hardens them, breaks them, transforms them into instruments of violence. But kindness, even to an enemy, changes history. It plants seeds that grow in unexpected soil. It creates bridges where only ruins should stand. It proves that civilization isn't merely what we build in peacetime, but what we maintain when everything argues against it. The young soldiers who marched through Texas gates expecting punishment, who braced for the hatred they thought they deserved, instead encountered something revolutionary, the principle that human dignity transcends nationality, that law applies even in chaos, that mercy isn't weakness. They carried that lesson home to the ashes of Germany, and in those ashes something new grew. The screens fade to archival photographs, faces young and uncertain, then older and wiser. Camp scenes dissolving into post-war reunions, enemies become allies, prisoners become friends, text appears. Over 425,000 German POWs were held in the US between 1942 and 1946. Many later became advocates of democracy in post-war Germany. The orchestral theme swells softly, then fades. Silence. Just the weight of what was and what it meant and what it still means.